Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land that we're meeting on. I acknowledge that the land was taken by force, it was never ceded. It was taken in a process of genocide and colonisation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that throughout the discussion. Australia Asia Worker Links, which is an organisation that I am here representing today, is an organisation that takes that struggle, the struggle for land rights and land justice and social justice of Aboriginal people in Australia and internationally. We take that struggle very seriously and we participate in struggle where we're invited to and where we've been asked to come in for support. And the Djapurrung is one such campaign and one such movement at the moment. So Australia Asia Worker Links, as has previously been talked about, is an organisation that builds international solidarity between workers, between unions, between labour movement organisations. And we build those links across borders, primarily because we recognise that this system, so this is a conversation that's been consistent across the panel this morning, and that the conference is focusing on, that system is international. And in terms of those borders, we recognise that those borders are actually artificial. They weren't made by us, they're not made for the system that created it, but they are made to contain us and to hold us. And some of the ways that Adele and others on the panel this morning spoke about that containment is a part of what I'm going to call the violence of that system. So how do you maintain those borders other than through violence, given we didn't create them? So we've been doing this work for 40 years. It's hard work. It takes a lot of trust to actually build the kinds of relationships with unions in Australia and overseas, mostly because of the violence of that system. So where I want to start the conversation is where Adele left off, actually. This issue or this conversation about migrant workers, about migration, and what I want to link it to is this key concept of deportation and what the power of deportation does in relation to maintaining migration, immigration. But also when we talk about deportation, what we're talking about is inside, outside, belonging, who's allowed, who's not allowed. And we tend to think about that as migrants, people that come from one country to another. But actually, that is not quite just how that deportation power works. So let's start with this issue of migrant workers. Adele talked about the holiday visa category of people, so people that come into Australia who say that they're holidaying and start to work. They're not the only ones that come in and work through the visa system. There's a myriad of what I'm going to call temporary visas. So again, creating this precariousness. So people come in to the country and work in an environment that is inherently unsafe, unstable, uncertain. So then you go to work. Adele talked about some very, not even extreme, but some very particular examples of what happens to people in an environment where your relationship to being able to stay is precarious, which means your relationship to being able to say what's going on is also precarious. So that is where that issue, the deportation power, becomes an important aspect of maintaining a system. But here's the other side of that, which I don't know that we've really looked at much today, is why would somebody employ another in that system of precariousness? What is there to gain from that? So the idea of this system, and I think it's probably necessary to give the system a name, because right now we're just calling it a system. Our comrades Carla and Lydia called it colonialism. Adele kind of talked about it as neoliberalism. There is another name for it that captures all of those components. which is capitalism. It is and I'm not saying that to say, capitalism, because I know that this is now the way that we use language. But if we look at what is capitalism, which is a system that is designed to derive profit, where it doesn't need to invest any money. So when you bring workers into the country to work and you maintain this precarious relationship between whether they can stay or not, it allows you effectively to drive down wages, to actually pay people less money for the work that they're doing. Which is similar to, or not even similar, it is the extension of, is this idea of colonialism. So actually going into another area of land and deriving profit from the land without having to give anything back. So our comrades on the panel today talked about the effects of that colonialism on their people. But the reason to come into a land relates to what is there. So what was in Australia when the British came in to colonise it? And in order to take that from the land, you need to destroy the people that are defending it. An act of violence. In the same way that when people go to work for somebody else's profit, why would you do that? How do you maintain that system? Is through acts of violence. So I want to talk about some of the ways that this drive to push wages down, but also theft, works as a broader violent system, and how we can change that. So in Australia, we talked about the horticulture industry. It also happens in the meat industry, where people come in on precarious visas, temporary visas, a system designed to mean that you can't, as soon as you start fighting, there is the threat to take you away. So in a country like Malaysia, one of the industries where this happens a lot is in the construction industry, where workers come in from Burma and build the country. And periodically, the Malaysian government calls a raid on the construction site and actually gathers up the temporary workers and deports them. But the way that power works is, in order to have people concerned for being deported, there is always a pool of people that aren't deported. So the only way you can keep people scared is that you maintain that some people don't ever get moved. So I was talking earlier about it is not just people from outside that come inside for whom this deportation power works. An international example of this colonialism but forcing people away is the Rohingya. So these are people who say that they belong to a particular area of land where the government is pushing them into another area, Bangladesh. So it is like the deportation power. It's saying some people belong, some people don't, and then you push them out. But they belong to the land from where they were pushed. And so when you look at a border country like Australia, where we have Indigenous people who are the custodians of this land, how do you create that inside-outside, effectively deportation power? Is you remove people from the land from where they come. You put them into prison. This is what Lydia was talking about. The violence of the system that requires a removal of the defenders of whatever was there that capital seeks to take. But more importantly, and this is something that Carla spoke about when she was talking about individualism and the way that system conceals some of these relationships. So in order for profits to continually to be derived from land, from workers, etc., you do need to say that it is the individual circumstances that gave that. Whereas actually, in order to deport people, you need there to be people in place and another place to go. So for there to be the deportation of the Rohingya from one area, there needs to be a Bangladesh where they don't belong to force them onto. There needs to be the immigrants, white or otherwise, in Australia to displace. But none of those people had a choice in that either. So in terms of how to fight, what is there to do? Well, the first thing to do is acknowledge that it's international. There is nothing particular or peculiar about Australia in relation to colonialism. What happens to Aboriginal people in Australia is replicated everywhere in the world. In North America, in South America, the Cordillera of the Philippines, the West Papuans, right across the world where there is either a displaced or an Indigenous population, the circumstances and the realities for those communities are the same. Overrepresented in prison, overrepresented in poor health statistics and education and homelessness, etc. That is not particular to Australia or Indigenous people. The issue of violence against women is not particular to Australia. Everywhere across the world, women are disproportionately impacted by violence perpetrated by men. Yet all of our responses are local. All of our responses are, how do we protect this woman from here, etc., which is necessary. We obviously necessarily need to have acute responses to circumstances of violence. But our campaigning is not what sits more broadly. What is the economic structure that gives the violence, that gives the protection of profits so that land is stolen, so that wages are driven down, so that conditions are destroyed in workplaces? What is that economic system and how do we fight that? So that I have been given the time signal, so I know that that was a very wordy and disjointed discussion and I apologise for that. But I will take questions in the second part.